Hello and welcome to the Gonzales Mitchell Show. I'm Clay Mitchell. Patrick is on assignment, and this time he actually is. He's out doing a couple of polls by the end of the month that are due, so he's under the wire today. Today our guest is Joy Ditto. She is the founder and CEO of Joy Ditto Consulting, which focuses on helping clients understand and position themselves to support the energy sector. She also helps clients shape their strategic engagement with the federal government, from Congress to agencies and the inside Beltway media. Joy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Clay. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, tell us, for those that don't know you, tell us about yourself, your background, and how you got where you are today.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Well, actually, I'm a military brat, and that I'm saying that for a reason is because my dad served our country, and I think the electric sector is just in some ways just as important as the military. So I gravitated to this sector after having worked on Capitol Hill after graduating college and sort of being exposed to a lot of different policy issues. And then went into the sector about 26 years ago and represented a portion of the sector called public power, which is not-for-profit electric utilities, at a trade association in the DC area. And did that for many years, became an executive, and then went over and represented investor-owned utilities, public power utilities, and rural co-ops at another group called the Utilities Technology Council, which focused on their deployment of communications technologies. And then went back to the American Public Power Association and was CEO there for several years before starting my own firm.
Great. We said 26 years. That just happens to sort of coincide with 1999, when Maryland deregulated the electric industry here under the guise or the theory that all this competition would lead to lower prices. But it hadn't quite worked out that way. So tell me what you think went wrong.
Oh, well, I think I'm a big fan of history and context. So I'm gonna take us a little bit down a path of giving your listeners and viewers some context. Look, electricity is what we think of as a natural monopoly. I'm not an economist, but I did study, the basic stuff in college. And so natural monopolies just mean that it's very difficult to provide a competitive environment for a variety of reasons. Electricity can't be replaced by anything else. It has a lot of infrastructure that it involves. That infrastructure is difficult, if not impossible, to move around. And so these are characteristics of natural monopolies, as opposed to a more competitive marketplace. And just interest of full disclosure, I'm a big fan of competition personally and professionally, but recognizing that there are certain types of critical infrastructure like electricity that are trend toward natural monopoly. Over the course of our history, we have really viewed it that way. Up until recently, up until the last 25 years, we viewed electricity as a natural monopoly that needs to be overseen by a regulator of some sort. And in our country, we actually bifurcate or trifurcate that regulatory situation. But back in the 80s and 90s, when there was a lot of talk about deregulation of a lot of different sectors, it kind of came to popularity in the electric sector too. Well, maybe there's a better way, a more efficient way of driving down costs. Are some of these natural monopolies, even though they're regulated, are they exerting market power? Are they hiding things from the regulators? And I also think legitimately in our sector, one of the things we have to do in the electric sector is we have to build our infrastructure to meet what we call the peaks. So the hottest day of the year or the coldest day of the year, when demand is at its highest, we have to meet that demand because you can't not have electricity, right? So we in our sector have to build to that demand. So on the other days of the year when the weather is mild, we have a lot of excess capacity that's just sitting dormant. And that seems to be inefficient, right? So there was a trend line to what can we do with that? Can we make it more efficient? Can we lower rates? And so that was why the discussion happened. And so theoretically, that seems like a great idea. Let's see if we can create more efficiency, squeeze it out of this natural monopoly. And therefore, that discussion occurred. But I think what is important to also understand in the electric sector is there's sort of two parts of it we look at when we think about regulation or deregulation or markets. You think of the retail side, which is all of those wires and poles that go into your homes and businesses. And then you think of the wholesale side, which is the large generation power plants, the generation facilities, big ones, right? The big nuclear facilities, all that. And then you think of the big transmission lines, right? So that are high voltage. Those are called wholesale, and they're regulated actually by the federal government. When it's interstate commerce, it's regulated by the federal government.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yes, there are some generation facilities at the state level, if they're not used in interstate commerce, that are regulated at the state level. But then all of those poles and wires going into homes and businesses are regulated at the state level. So sort of the retail rates are regulated at the state level, and the wholesale rates generally are regulated at the federal level. So when we were talking about deregulation back then, and even now, because there's some that still exist, like in Maryland, we are talking about two different things. So the states have a role and the feds have a role, right? And what's happened in the last 25 years is that certain states proceeded with that idea of deregulation, kind of creating some maybe market environments to try to spur additional efficiency. And then in certain parts of the country, there's a wholesale deregulation that happened, but not everywhere. So kind of the good news is that we have comparisons. Certain states did it, certain states didn't. Certain parts of the country have more of a wholesale marketplace and other parts don't. So we have a compare and contrast within our own country, because it was not federally mandated to do all of this, right? So deregulation, in the sense of the electric sector has been, from a rate standpoint, the way it was billed, you mentioned earlier, Clay, that it was discussed, and you remember it very well, as lowering rates. That has absolutely not been the case. It has not met that promise, unfortunately.
Obviously not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so we can get into that too in more detail if you want.
Let me ask you this. In Maryland, we keep hearing about the PJM, which is the operator of the grid that we share. Theoretically, we're supposed to have that managed and have some lower prices. Maryland has to go out actually to the wholesale market, as you say, and bid on electricity and electricity supply. We've closed 4, 5, 6 different power plants here in the States, so we're not producing any supply to put on the grid like we used to. I think we only have a smattering of power generators left. What is Maryland doing wrong? Should we reopen some of these power plants with natural gas, or like some want, they just want to double down on wind and solar, which I think only supplies 4 or 5% of our electricity?
Well, gosh, there's a lot to that question. I'm going to actually come back to, because we talked about renewables a little bit. We talked about wholesale power and what Maryland can do. So I'm going to come back to the renewables question, because I think that's an important one. Sure. But I'm going to start with, so I mentioned that the federal government regulates the wholesale power system. And in some states, that system is still run by utilities. So basically, you still have large utilities that own generation, those large transmission lines, and the distribution entities. And we call that vertically integrated. It's kind of an economic term that you may remember as well from studying that back in the day. So we do have states still like that. In Maryland, when you all deregulated back in 1999, you did a few things. You said, at the retail level, entities can compete to provide service, even though they didn't actually own poles and wires. You can do that. That's since been rolled back. But the main thing that you did, that it was more of a restructuring, was you said to your utilities, you have to divest your generation. And so the utilities can only own distribution poles and wires and transmission lines. They can't own their own generation. So instead, the power plants are owned by what are called independent power producers. And those are not regulated, rate regulated at all. They just sell their products into the wholesale market. So you basically have utilities forced. They have to buy. They can't build. So they are forced to buy, which gives them little option. So they have to buy into this wholesale market called PJM, which was created many, many years ago originally to get at some of that efficiency I was talking about when you don't have your peak days, so a long time ago, PJM, Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. So those are you guys were part of the original group, formed sort of what is, called a power pool. And that eventually became PJM, which has now parts of 13 states and the District of Columbia. So a big footprint to operate the grid. They don't own anything. They just operate the grid, and they operate a market that where you bid in your power plant prices day ahead in real time. And then there's also another marketplace where it's more for planning for growth, and that's called a capacity market. And so there's three, and then there's actually a fourth that's called ancillary services, which is sort of a truing up part of the marketplace. So that's what you're talking about. So now the utilities in Maryland don't have any choice but to buy power from PJM. And PJM's prices have gone up because I was telling you before, electricity is a natural monopoly. The market itself is not, the market that PJM runs is not a truly competitive market the way we think of competition in other places like clothes or, like things that are really easy to replace and also to create new ones and innovate. It's not like that in PJM. It's the same old commodity, right? And they have tried to create market mechanisms that, in my opinion, haven't. Well, it's not just in my opinion. I don't think they've worked, but they haven't reduced prices. That's the key. And
that's obvious.
especially if you look at the retail side of the equation, prices have gone up over time, and I can give you some data points on that. So what to do here? I think I want to kind of just say, because we could be talking for 2 days on this topic. The good news is that Maryland has the choice to, as you kind of alluded to, Clay, potentially say to the utilities, hey, you can go back and own your generation. You can do that again. Now, Maryland would still have to approve that generation. And you sort of alluded that, yeah, Maryland has closed. There's been power plants that have closed in Maryland, perhaps for some reasons that are state law reasons for, you can't have a natural gas plant. So environmental or climate change reasons, those still need to be discussed sort of in a different bucket, right? Where do you want that generation to exist? But if a utility in Maryland can own its own generation, then that gives it more leverage. Even if the PJM market continues, they could actually then bid in their own generation into the market and get that benefit of whatever that price is and bring that back to the ratepayers in Maryland. So the good news is Maryland has some control over this, and there is a Senate bill that has been introduced that would do this in some capacity. I think that is the really good news about this situation. In terms of renewables, I've seen some commentary online about, well, if you allowed utilities to own their own generation again, well, they wouldn't build renewables. And I beg to differ. The top 7 states that have developed renewables, of those states, 4 out of the 7 are not in regulated environments. They're not in deregulated environments. They're not like Maryland. So they never deregulated. Their utilities still own generation. And they're producing renewable energy like wildfire. And so, they're in the state of Kansas being one example. They're one of the lowest, they have some of the lowest retail rates in the country, and they produce a lot of renewable energy in that state. They're a heavy wind state. Does that seem to
be the preferred or the most efficient way to do it, is to allow the utilities to own their own generation, like you said, Kansas, or is, in your view, is what Maryland's doing by its version of deregulation not working?
Well, it's not working. It's not working from the sense that rates are going up at a higher rate in Maryland than they are in other parts of the country. And if you look at the data, there's a great study that Harvard Business School did in 2024 that looks at this in great depth. If you look at the data, the trend line is, so not only are rates going up in the state of Maryland and in other parts of PJM and states that have kind of gone to this restructured environment where their utilities don't own generation. Not only have rates gone up, but they've gone up at a higher rate than other states that have not done that. So meaning the
Right.
delta is increasing. And that actually impacts national averages, because there are some states that actually their rates haven't gone up as substantially at all. But if you have states that their rates are kind of blowing up, it impacts the national averages. And that's where you hear about these affordability issues. Well, that affordability issue is not acute in many, many states. In fact, it's not non-existent in some states. Some states it very much is. And Maryland, unfortunately, is one of them. So with renewables, I mean, I think it's clear you were asking whether it's more efficient to have this sort of vertical integration, because utilities are natural monopolies.
With the vertical integration, and the bill you were referring to, I think is Senate Bill 954,
yes,
which is currently in the hopper there in Annapolis. The thing that I think concerns a lot of people to the way that this approach is Maryland changed its laws going back, 10, 12 years ago, to where the utilities can go out and they can do improvements to the grid. They can expand the grid, to the infrastructure, but the costs of that are borne solely and billed directly to the ratepayers and not necessarily the stockholders of the utilities. There are complaints recently that the rates are soaring. The price of electricity for a normal home is just doubled what it was a few years ago. Yet the infrastructure part of the bill that's billed has really gone up, and that's become more and more of an affordability problem for residential ratepayers. Should there be a way or responsibility for the utilities through their stockholders to bear some or most of these costs instead of directly billing ratepayers?
Well, I mean, so in the case of, I think ratepayers should pay the cost that it costs to pay to do electricity. I mean, that's you're paying for a service.
Mm-hmm.
So in my opinion, and that's the way it works on the not-for-profit side. So there are not-for-profit utilities across the country. They serve about 30% of the ratepayers across the country. There aren't as many in Maryland, these not-for-profit utilities. But in the case of the not-for-profit utilities, they pass through all of their costs to their customers, but they don't have a profit margin, right? So that differential is, depends, right? It depends on the state regulatory environment as to how much that allowable profit margin is. But to your point, the good news is that in a regulated environment, the rates are determined by the regulator, which in the case of Maryland is the Maryland Public Service Commission. So they can say, we only want the utility to get a 4% profit or a 2% profit or a 10% profit. That usually varies up to maybe 10%. And it depends on the state as to how much is allowable in that situation. So absolutely the Maryland PSC and voters who, vote in the governor who appoints the PSC, they have a role in saying like what's reasonable here. And that's a case across the country where there's regulatory environments. So the decision point about how much profit should be accumulated is really in that regulatory regime. You were asking about efficiency, and as I said before, none of this is entirely efficient. I think where we get more and more efficient in is those when you have those peak days, there's really hot days or there's really cold days. If you can figure out ways to still be able to sell your generation to others who might need it in neighboring states. So having this idea of a wholesale environment where you can still sell your power in and out, either bilaterally or sort of in these day ahead or real-time markets, is not necessarily a bad idea. And it has been more successful outside of PJM, because the fact of the matter is that in PJM, most of the states that are in PJM that are fully served by PJM have done the same thing that Maryland's done. They've had their utilities divest their generation. But in other places in the country that have these constructs, these wholesale markets like PJM, They've done better because their utilities have retained their generation. They're still vertically integrated. And that means that there's a correlation between if they make money in that market because they've been able to sell their generation to a neighboring state on a day when it's blue sky and they don't need it, they bring that money back to their ratepayers, right? To their customers. So there's a direct correlation rather than it going to these independent generators who just put them in, that's just their profit. And some of these profits have increased. I mean, they're 30% profits. So if we're talking about 5 to 10% for a utility or whatever the number is that's comfortable in Maryland, it's much higher for these independent power producers, and it just goes into their pockets and it never comes back to the ratepayer. So I think there is some efficiency, at least from a ratepayer standpoint, from a retail ratepayer standpoint, for the generation to come back to the state. And then what that actual generation looks like, whether it's renewable or not, can be determined by your legislature and et cetera. I mean, and that's a whole nother podcast, right? Is what
right. I think looking at the clock on the wall, boy, our time is winding down. I'll tell you what, I'd like to have you back on again to talk about the data centers and kind of a problem, and whether data centers should be required to put up their own power generation. But I really would. I'd like to have you on again here soon to discuss that.
That'd be great.
But you know, Joy, it's a sunny day outside. We really have to go out and play now. And I'm afraid we're at the point of the show where it's time to say goodbye, Patrick.
Goodbye, Patrick.
Goodbye, Patrick, wherever you are. Joy, it was a pleasure having you on the show today, and I look forward to having you back on here sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.